All right, we're going to continue in our study of Psalm 128 as an exercise and going through the process of the poetic analysis. So we started that a few sessions ago, where we were looking at, again, the steps for poetic analysis, if you remember, is first reading and observing the poem, and then identifying the setting and the structure of the poem, then looking at parallelism, imagery, poetic devices, and then summarizing each stanza. So that's what we're doing with Psalm 128. So let's go ahead and read this psalm again. I'm going to ask if Jen Cheng, if you could read that for us, that would be great.
Okay. A song of ascents. How blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. When you shall eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy, and it will be well with you. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants around your table. Behold, for thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion, and may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Indeed, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to continue our study of this particular psalm as a practice, just going through the steps for poetic analysis. We did the first one a few sessions ago, where we read and observed the poem. We came up with several observations from the poem. And now, last week, we focused our attention on the setting and the structure of the poem. And we looked at the background context first, so the setting, remember. So I'll just remind us of a few key points we looked at last time, and then we'll continue in our analysis. But if you remember, again, the background is important. Each poem has its own setting, has its own circumstances, its own author, recipient's purpose. There's a setting to it, an occasion behind the writing of the poem, something that prompted the author to write it. And so in the setting of the poem, we're trying to figure that out, trying to understand, okay, what do we know who wrote it? Who did he write it to? What names does he mention? What places does he mention? What does he talk about his situation? What prompted the psalm? And so those are the things we're looking for, trying to understand the background of the psalm, or what we call the setting. And so for Psalm 128, one of the things you first want to look at is, does the psalm have a title or a superscript? And in this case, it does. It's simply this: a song of ascents. So we've talked about that, that these were a group of songs that were put together with the intention to be sung during one of the 3 annual feasts. So I've put that here. And so we're really given the occasion, excuse me, for the psalm. That we're given the intent of the author is that this song is intended to be sung during these one of the 3 annual feasts. Now, each of these songs of ascent has a particular theme and focus, but it's important to understand first that what that title means. Now, in this case, we're not given who the author is. Some of them we are, some we aren't, but we at least know what he intended for it to be used by. Again, the author's not mentioned. The tone here is a tone of instruction. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Who are the recipients? Well, we talked about last week, the primary audience would have been the Jews going up to these feasts. So here we notice that again, this is a song of ascent, so that's going to be the audience, but the particular focus is on men. Notice he says, your wife. Thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. So, and then your children's children, verse 6. And so we see here there's a particular focus on men. The psalm begins with a general statement, how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. So that's a general principle that's true for all humanity. But verse 2, he zeroes in, narrows his focus. He says, when you shall eat of the fruit, when you will be happy, it will be well with you. Your wife shall be. So verse 2 begins a focus on men in particular. And so, so that's the specific audience in this psalm. All right. Generally speaking, all the Hebrew pilgrims, but specifically the focus is on men. When was it written? Well, we don't know who the author is. And so it could be anywhere from the time of David, even before that, but I know it would be from David or beyond. All the way to possibly during the exile. We have songs of ascent written by David, and then some couple written at the end. Psalm 126 was during the exile, Babylonian exile. So it could be anywhere in there. So we don't have enough information to tell us specifically. And it's not that significant for us to know in this case. The geography, that is, what places are mentioned. Well, we see here Zion. Zion is mentioned. Jerusalem, of course, which we know a lot about Jerusalem, and then Israel. So those are the places mentioned. And then normally in the setting, you would want to give a little more information. What do we know about them? Zion, if you study that, can refer either to the city of Jerusalem, or it could refer to the Temple Mount or the temple itself. And so here it seems to be, because Jerusalem and Israel are mentioned specifically, it's probably not a reference to Jerusalem in this case, but more likely the temple area, which makes sense, again, because these songs of ascent were intended to be sung as the people came towards Jerusalem, but specifically towards the temple. So that's likely what's going on here. Of course, we know Jerusalem as the city of David, the capital city of Israel at that time. The social context and the setting is normally, these are what people are mentioned here. Now, there's no specific names given, but we do have the general references to wife, children, excuse me, and grandchildren, which again tells us the focus of this psalm is the family, is the home. Now, cultural setting. So this is what you're going to want to identify. What are some of the practices or understanding of the culture in which the audience exists? So here we'd want to know, what's the significance of the vine and the olive plant for the people of Israel in that day? So, because notice he mentions the wife like a fruitful vine, children like olive plants. And so it'd be important to understand not what we know about these things, but what would the hearers, the original audience, what would be their understanding? What is the significance of these things to them? Because the wife and children are being compared to a vine and olive plants. Another cultural importance would be those annual feasts. Again, if this poem was written with the intent to be sung during those 3 annual feasts, it will be important for us to understand what do we know about those feasts. And so we'd have to do a little bit of homework. Look back in Leviticus in particular. Now that Daniel's studying Leviticus, he can be our feast expert. But what do we know about the Feast of Booths and Pentecost? What do we understand about Passover? And again, this is because we're trying to place ourselves into that original time when the psalm is written as best we can, and understand how would the original audience have perceived, understood these particular things. So knowing information about these feasts, what they were for, what their purpose was, what they signified. That will help us better understand the psalm. All right. So those would be cultural things to consider. Perhaps even the role of the wife and children in the homes might be another one in that time period. And then finally, the occasion. That's the key. Is what's the circumstance that prompted the writing of this psalm? And again, this psalm was written specifically for families to sing together in preparation for one of these feasts. Okay, so this is just a summary of the setting. You're going to want to have more detail like we did last week. We had a lot more detail, but I'm just sort of giving a summary to remind us of what we covered. And you can look in the notes from the last session to get the details. Now what we want to do is identify the type of poem. If you remember, we covered the different psalm types back when we were looking at the Psalms, introduction to the Psalms. We had the praise psalms, laments, wisdom psalms, royal psalms. We had what were some of the other ones? The enthronement psalms that focused on Yahweh as king, wisdom psalms. So we had, I can't remember, we covered 8 or 9 different types. Some scholars have really gone overboard and have identified 20 or 30 different types of psalms, but we just covered sort of the more general, specific ones. And as we look at Psalm 128, we see that it is a song of ascent, so it fits under that category. But as we look at this psalm, we also notice that it really, I think, would fit best under as a wisdom psalm. Because notice it's very instruction oriented, right? And in fact, really a term that's often used in wisdom literature is how blessed, or the word blessed. Right? We see that in Proverbs. We see that in several other Psalms, like Psalm 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked or stand in the path of sinners. Even Psalm 2, which is a messianic psalm, but also has this idea of blessed, how a person is blessed. And so here it's really, I would say, a psalm intended to give instruction to men in particular. So I would categorize it as not only a song of ascents, but also the tone is one of instruction, a wisdom psalm. All right. We don't see here elements of a lament or a royal psalm, no, it's more along the lines of giving instruction. And there are several, as we've talked about before, several wisdom psalms in the Psalter. Psalm 90 would be another example. Psalm 78, where these psalms are particularly focused on giving instruction. Psalm 1. All right, so this step, you're just identifying the type of psalm, and I would put it under that. All right, any questions to this point? Is what we covered so far, or any comments? Okay. So in this step, we're identifying the setting and the structure of the poem. So that includes looking at the background, which we've done, identifying the type of psalm, which we just did, and then looking at the structure of the psalm. If you remember when we talked about this, the structure, poems have a structure, and that structure is, there are a few aspects to it. One is that typically poems are laid out in stanzas. So they'll have, there's an overall purpose or theme to the poem, but then that theme is often broken up into subpoints, so to speak, or like in an epistle, paragraphs have particular units of thought. In a psalm, in a poem, stanzas represent those units of thought. And so poems typically will have 2, 3, or 4 stanzas where it's connected to the overall theme, but it's a particular point or thought that the author is making, and that's linked to the other stanzas. And so together we can identify the overall purpose or message of the psalm, but that message is often broken up into these stanzas. We see that in, in songs today, or hymns, where you'll have stanzas that'll be, 3 or 4 or 5 lines that are focused on one particular thought, and then another stanza which will have another thought related to the same overall theme. And that's indeed what we see here in this psalm. And so this step is we try to identify what are those stanzas. And so I went through with you in a previous session sort of how to do that. One thing we want to do is look at the translations. How do the translations break up the psalm and the stanzas? So that's one thing, but the translations don't always agree. And so I shared with you, we went through several other things to look for, things like refrains or an inclusio, things like the grammar. Do we see a shift in the pronouns, or do we see a change in the kinds of verbs? Sometimes you'll see a psalm that has commands and then changes towards statements. Do we see a change in the focus? There seemed to be a shift in what the theme is as the poem goes along. So these are things to look for. You can go back to, I forget what session that is, where we covered that. But for this particular psalm, as we take a look at it, the first thing we want to do is check the translations. Now here, I gave the New American Standard. And again, if you'll remember, here, in fact, let me do this. Normally, the translations will identify the stanzas by putting a space. So here's the New American Standard, and notice we have a space here between verses 4 and 5. And so New American Standard is indicating the first stanza is verses 1 to 4, and then the second stanza is verses 5 and 6. All right. Now, if we go to the Legacy Standard Bible, we actually see the same thing. Notice there's a space between verses 4 and 5. So here we can see that the Legacy has 2 stanzas, verses 1 to 4, verses 5 and 6. How about the English Standard Version? Well, that one, they've identified 3 stanzas. Right? If you can see here, notice there's a space between verses 2 and 3 and a space between verses 5 and 6. And so they have 3 stanzas. The New King James, it's another translation I like to look at. They have 3 stanzas as well. But if you notice, these 3 stanzas are verse 1 and then the space between verses 4 and 5. So they have the first stanza is just verse 1, the second stanza is 2 to 4, and then the third is 5 and 6. All right. How about the NIV? Well, if we look at the NIV, it also matches the New American Standard and the Legacy. Notice there's a space here between verses 4 and 5. Okay, and so if we put together all of these, we'll notice that the translations have, I summarized it here for you. Basically, we have, let me do it this way. The New American Standard, the LSB, Legacy Standard, NIV all have 2 stanzas. ESV has 3, and the New King James has 4. So you say, well, they don't all agree with one another. But we do see, excuse me, we do see 3 that are in agreement. So, that might give us some, influence us a little bit. But now we want to look for other things. All right. What do we notice here? Well, as you look at this psalm, is there anything else here that would seem to guide us towards perhaps what the structure of this particular psalm is. You guys notice anything else, either in the grammar or focus or a refrain or inclusio or anything like that? Anybody have any observations that might indicate the stanzas here?
So, Pastor Tim, last week we also studied if verses 1 and 4, how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord. And 4 again, behold, thus shall be the man be blessed who fears the Lord. This is inclusio. And then my observation is that inclusio is beginning and end. That is one stanza.
Yes. Yeah, good. Yeah, we had that observation before, the inclusio. And if you remember, an inclusio is basically the same thing given at the beginning and the end of a stanza, or sometimes the whole poem. But here, it's in this inclusio is in the middle of the poem. So at verse 1, blesses everyone who fears the Lord. Verse 4, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. So yes, I think there's an inclusio here that would tell us verses 1 to 4 go together. So yeah, that's a very important observation. All right, so at least that would indicate verses 1 to 4 are one stanza, and then probably 5 and 6 are another. There's no inclusio in verses 5 and 6, but there is in verses 1 to 4. All right, good. Is there anything else we notice that might give further support to having these two stanzas then? Verses 1 to 4 and then verses 5 and 6.
Pastor Tim, I think the verses 5 and 6 mentioned about the place, Zion, Jerusalem, Israel.
Yes, great observation. Yeah, there seems to be a broader focus, doesn't there, verses 5 and 6. Verses 1 to 4, only thing mentioned is there's no place mentioned necessarily. His house, his table, right? That's focused on the home. But 5 and 6, yeah, Zion, Jerusalem, Israel. So there seems to be a broader focus in 5 and 6 compared to 1 to 4. So great observation. Okay, so that would also support two stanzas. Anything else anybody notice here? One other thing, notice the change in the tone here. If you look at verses 1 to 4, how blessed he's focusing on this idea of in the home, direct statements, right? These are all, but then notice verses 5 and 6 is more like a tone of a prayer. May you see, may you see. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem. May you see your children's children. And even verse 5, the Lord bless you. It's more the idea of may the Lord bless you. So there's verses 5 and 6 are more like a prayer almost. All right, an expression of the desire of the psalmist. Whereas verses 1 to 4 are more to focus on direct statements regarding those who fear the Lord and the impact on their homes and their lives. And so I think we see a shift in the tone as well going through. So all of these things, I think, make a very, very strong case that we have two stanzas here. The inclusio is a very strong indication, and then even what John Cheng mentioned about the places, the focus, there's a difference there, and then even again the tone. All right, so that would support what the New American Standard and the NIV indicated as far as having two stanzas. And it makes sense. Notice the first stanza, the focus is the home, the home of the man who fears the Lord. All right, his land, his labors, his wife, his children. So we have the inclusio, verse 1 and verse 4, and then inside the inclusio is really a focus on the man's life. Okay? So that really, I think, to me, is pretty clear that verses 1 to 4 is one stanza, and then again 5 and 6 focuses on beyond the man's home, Zion, then Jerusalem, then Israel. And yes, the children's children are mentioned. The days of your life are mentioned. So again, there's going to be a connection, right? Because this psalm all has one overarching theme. But the focus in the first stanza is a little different than in the second. The first is more narrow. It's more instructive, more direct statements. The second portion of the psalm is a broader look at not just the man's life, but even beyond that, to the temple, to the city, to the nation, and really in the form of more of a prayer or a request, a desire for the Lord to bless, for him to see the prosperity of Jerusalem and his grandchildren. All right. So I would definitely go with the two stanzas as identified by those translations. Because again, remember that the translations are not inspired, but just, those who have put in diligent study, and this is their opinion as to how the poem is structured. And often translations will have good agreement, but sometimes they diverge a little. And so we don't want to just rely on the translations, but they can be a helpful guide. And in this case, as we do further examination of the poem, we find other supports for two stanzas within the poem. Any thoughts about that or questions? Does that make sense, guys? Now you may think, well, why do we want to understand the structure of the poem? How's that going to help us? Well, again, just like in epistles, knowing each paragraph and identifying the key theme or focus in each paragraph is a helpful way to see the author's flow of thought through the writing. And so it's the same in the poems. If we can identify the units of thought, we can see how his flow, what he gives particular focus on going through the poem, and then how those connect together. Now, in a poem like this, it's very short, so you only have these two short stanzas. But it's helpful to understand as we look at the poem, think, okay, there's a focus here on, his home, his life, personal life, and then there's a broader focus on the city, the temple, the nation. So we want to ask ourselves, well, okay, these seem to be two particular units of thought, but how are they connected to one another? And we won't answer that right now, but knowing that this is, a single poem with an overarching theme and purpose, and we see it broken down into these two thoughts, two units of thought, two stanzas, we want to ask ourselves, okay, so what's the connection between them? How does what he says in verse 1 to 4, how does that relate to or connect to verses 5 and 6? these aren't two separate poems. It's one poem, but there seems to be two thoughts being given within that poem, two stanzas, and they are connected in some way. All right, and so as we identify the stanzas, the structure of a poem, we then begin asking a question, okay, how do these stanzas link together to bring the overall message or theme of the poem? Again, we'll come back to this a little bit later, but that's I think a very important aspect of identifying the structure of the poem. Okay. Thoughts or questions before we go to the next step? And like I said, in fact, let me see if I can find. There are a few other ways, a few other indicators into how to identify the stanzas. So I was going to see if I could just pull that up real quick to remind you, because I think it's an important. All right. Yeah, here it is. Okay, let me just show you this real quick, just to remind us. All right. So I mentioned here, okay, this is how do we identify the structure or outline of the psalm. First, we look at the translations, as we mentioned, and as I said, there's not always agreement in the translations. So then we want to look for other markers, like a refrain. Remember, that's sort of like a chorus. You see a repeated line in the poem that would function as being like the end of each stanza. Psalm 46 is one example. Look for a change in speaker or a change in pronouns, like Psalm 23. You see a shift in pronouns. Look for a change in the subject matter or the theme, like we saw in Psalm 128, the focus on the home in verses 1 to 4, and then the focus on the city and the nation after that. Change in the tone. Sometimes Salah, remember that instruction to pause, sometimes that can mark out stanzas. Look for exclamations, like Psalm 3. There's this, "O Lord," really seems to divide up the Psalms. And there's a change in grammar on the verb tense or the verb type. And Psalm 99 shows this. There's a shift in how the grammar is used. And then as we saw in Psalm 128, the use of an inclusio. Okay, inclusios are not that common, but and often inclusios are used like at the beginning and end of a whole psalm, but sometimes there's a few of them, like here in Psalm 128 or Psalm 67, where we see an inclusio inside of the psalm. And so these are things to remember in looking at the structure. Okay. All right. So again, any questions or comments before we look at parallelism? Anybody? Okay. Well, let's go to the next step in our poetic analysis. After we've read and observed the poem, after we've identified the setting and the structure of the poem, we now want to go back and examine the parallelism in the poem. That's another type of structure that we've looked at before. If you'll remember, the types of parallelism that we studied, it's here on the right screen. Maybe I'll make it a little bigger. Okay, remember parallelism describes there's a relationship within each verse. There's a relationship between the lines within each verse. And there are different kinds that have been identified. We just looked at really three main types of parallelism. Synonymous parallelism, which is where the second line essentially repeats the first line, but there'll be the use of synonyms. It won't say exactly the same thing, but it's the same idea repeated. There's also contrastive parallelism, where the second line gives a contrasting idea to the first. And then developmental, that's the broader category, where one line develops the other. And there's three ways that we identified how it develops. Either it adds, expands, it gives more information, or one line gives an explanation or illustration of the other line. Or a third type of developmental is that one line gives the result or the reason, the purpose for the other line. Okay, so these three, synonymous, contrastive, and developmental, were the three general types we identified. And then again, under developmental, we have these three types of developmental. Formal or unknown, that was just, it's not, sometimes it's not clear if there's a connection between the lines. And then finally, we also, a special case of the synonymous or contrastive is chiasm, where the second line is reversed. The ordering of the verb and the subject and the object are reversed to give particular emphasis. We saw that and when we went through Psalm 51 together. We saw many examples of that. Okay, but the main three that we want to look for are these: synonymous, contrastive, or developmental. So let's do that now for Psalm 28. Remember, to do the parallelism, we identify how many lines are contained within the verse, and then identify the type of parallelism being used between each line. And so I'll do the first one just to remind us of how we do this, and then I'll have you guys take over for the remaining ones. But if we look at verse 1, how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. So we might ask, well, what kind of parallelism is this? Well, first we want to ask, how many lines do we have here? And there are 2 lines here. So we just have 2 lines that are being compared with one another. And now that we ask, well, what is the relationship then between those 2 lines? Well, notice here, the second line looks a lot like the end of the first line, right? Who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. But the second line, there's this statement, how blessed is everyone, is not included, but it's implied, right? He's saying, how blessed is everyone who fears the Lord? How blessed is everyone who walks in his ways? So this is a synonymous. He's saying a similar thing between these lines. Notice who walks, who fears. Now, one could say, well, maybe it's developmental. That's just adding everyone who fears the Lord and then adds to that who walks in his ways. But I think here it's the idea of who walks in his ways is describing what who fears the Lord looks like. So I would say it's more along the lines of a synonymous parallelism in this case. Okay? All right. Verse 2. Let me ask Daniel. Brother Daniel, if you could read verse 2 and then tell us what type of parallelism you see here.
When you shall eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy, and it will be well with you. Things is developmental, and
well, first, how many lines? How many lines do we have?
Two lines there.
2 lines. Yep. Okay. And
yeah,
then
so And so it's developmental in the sense that it's one line gives the result of the other.
Good.
So it's you eat a fruit and you're happy and you're well.
Good. Yeah, the second line is really giving the result of the first line.
Yeah.
Notice the word when. All right. When you do this, when you eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy. So that'll be the result. Okay, good. So line 2 gives the result of line 1. Okay. So he's not adding more information here specifically, but he's just telling us what is the result or what happens after line 1. When you do this, then this will take place. Okay. Now, if this were like expansion, that word when wouldn't be there. If it was just, you shall eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy, it will be well. Those would be just two statements. But notice that word when, actually tells us there's a different relationship between these two lines. He's not just giving information. He's saying that when you do the first line, then the second line will result. So that's why we focused on this as developmental result, not addition or expansion. If it had just been, you shall eat of the fruit of your hands, you will be happy, that would be okay. Second line is just adding to the first. But that word when tells us that there's a different kind of relationship between the two lines. Okay? All right. Shulong, I'm going to give you this one. Verse 3.
Okay, verse 3. 3, right? Okay. Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house, your children like olive plants around your table.
Okay, we first want to identify how many lines.
4 lines.
Yeah, the translation has 4 lines here. Now the challenge is, what's the relationship between, because we have more than 2 lines now we are considering, okay, what's the relationship between lines 1 and 2? And then we'll think about lines 3 and 4 after that.
Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine within your house. Okay, within your house is actually the what we call that, the developmental expansion.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good developmental. And so then it'd be the same between lines 3 and 4, right?
4, yeah.
Okay. And then when you have multiple lines, you also want to ask, okay, what's the relationship then between perhaps, and I would see it, there looks like a relationship between lines 1 and 2 and lines 3 and 4. What does that look like to you?
It looks like a synonymous.
Yes. Yeah, I think 1 and 2 are synonymous with 3 and 4. You guys see that? Your wife, your children shall be like your children, like a fruitful vine, olive plants within your house, around your table. Do you see that? It's really a synonymous kind of relationship. So this is a little more unique verse in terms of the parallelism. But as we have more than 2 lines, it gets a little more complicated. But notice we still see patterns. So I think Shulong has correctly identified this this one very well, that there is a relationship within lines 1 and 2 and also lines 3 and 4, but also there's a broader relationship between the first 2 lines with the second 2 lines. All right, great job. So any questions or comments about this one? Does that make sense? When we have multiple lines, it gets a little more complicated, but you look for relationships, not just between the 2 neighboring lines, but then also between the other lines in the verse. Any questions, comments about that? Does that make sense to you guys? Again, this is one of the elements of Hebrew poetry, is sort of this these interrelationships within the verse. That's one of the things that we've noticed in studying Hebrew poetry, this parallelism, if you will. And so sometimes there's a more, what's the word, more skillful, more involved parallelism being used when there are multiple lines within. Questions so far? All right, let's look at the next line then, the next verse. All right, verse 4. I'm going to ask Brother Dwayne, take a crack at this one.
Behold, for thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. Oh boy.
Yeah, I thought I'd give you a fun one. So the easy part, how many lines? How many lines are we dealing with here?
You know, I guess it's one, huh? Blessed, behold, for thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. You can just kind of flow that through there. Or do you want two?
Well, that's the thing. If you notice, should have reviewed this real quick. If you notice, as the translations lay out, you know, we know if we go to, like, so for example, if we're reading a narrative, right? Let's just go to Genesis. If we read a narrative, right, it's laid out in the paragraph form, right? Same with an epistle. We go to Philippians, for example. It's laid out in the form of paragraphs, okay? But when we go to poetry, notice that it lays out the translation structure by lines. So notice the New American Standard has, you know, the 2 lines, verse 1, 2 lines in verse 2, and then as we just saw, 4 lines in verse 3. And so the structure indicates, the translation indicates how many lines within each verse by its layout, by its format. So verse 4, yeah, it's kind of one idea or one thought, but it's still laid out in 2 lines. The first line is, behold, thus shall the man be blessed. The second line is, who fears the Lord. And so we do have 2 lines here. Now the question is, what's the relationship between those 2 lines? In other words, what kind of parallelism is there? Do you have any thoughts, Dwayne?
It looks like this man who's blessed, it's describing him. It develops him. Well, no, it describes him. You know, he's the blessed because he fears the Lord.
Yeah, exactly. So you just, in parallelism language, we would say, right, you just indicate the reason he's blessed is because he fears the Lord. So as we think about that, looking at our types of parallelism, what would that fall under? Do we have any here that describe where one line is giving the reason for the other?
Well, it's developing, isn't it?
Yep. Yep. Developmental, and then notice we have one of the categories is reason. One line gives this should say reason or result of the other line. And that's exactly what we have here. Line, right? Line 1 is the result of line 2. The man who fears the Lord shall be blessed. All right. Very good. Okay. John Cheng, I'm going to give you verse 5 here. If I can get it. So if you can go ahead and read verse 5, John Cheng, and then if you're there, if you're available. Maybe he's occupied right now. Pastor Philip, are you there? Can you do verse 5? Oh,
Yes, yes, Pastor Tim, I will try.
okay. John Cheng,
I
I'll
have
give you
a
verse
very-
6. John Cheng, so
Okay.
go ahead, Philip, Pastor Philip, verse 5.
Yeah, sorry, let me video off because the limited
Yeah, no problem.
connection. Yeah. The Lord bless you from Zion, and may you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. Yeah. I think this is developmental, and then the second line develops from the first line.
Developmental. Okay,
Yeah.
so you got 2 lines here.
Yeah, and expand, expansion, development and expansion. Second line expanded the first.
Yeah, he's adding more to the first line. And yeah, you may say, well, wait a minute, it looks like 3 lines here. Well, notice the second line, I've indented it. So that it is 2 lines. Okay. It's just whenever you don't have enough space, enough width on the page, then they will put the second line, they'll indent it like that. And we can see that. Let me show you an example from, let me see if there's a psalm. We can see that maybe. Okay, how about do this? If the page isn't wide enough, notice what happens. So verse 2 is 2 lines, okay? Or we're doing verse 5 here, right? Notice verse 5, we got 2 lines, but the bottom one is indented here just to show it's still part of that second line. But if there's enough space, I can get notice if the page is wide enough, it'll just go out to 1 line.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so, oops. So you were correct in determining there are 2 lines. It's just on my page, I didn't have a wide enough page to fit the second line. So that's why you see this. Okay, but yeah, 2 lines, developmental expansion. Now, here's something interesting. If we look at the other translations, okay, this was the New American Standard. 2 lines, the Legacy Standard. Legacy Standard has 2 lines, but the ESV has 3 lines. The New King James has 3 lines. Let's see the NIV. NIV has 3 lines. Well, so which is it? Is it 2 lines or is it 3 lines? And you'll see this kind of thing, this is not unusual at all. But sometimes you'll have the translations will have a different number of lines. So, well, creates a little bit of a problem for us, right? Because if we're trying to identify the relationship between the lines, if one translation has 2 lines and another has 3, then, well, which is it? And how do they come up with the different number of lines? Right. So, in a moment, I want to, I'll explain to you why that is. But before we do that, we'll come back to this. I want to do verse 6 first, have John Cheng do verse 6 for us. So we'll finish the parallelism in the poem. Then we're going to come back. I want to talk to you about Hebrew accents and how it's connected to determining the number of lines within a verse. But before we do that, let's go ahead and do verse 6. And John Cheng, can you read verse 6?
Yes.
And then we'll do that. Then we'll come back and talk about the lines.
Okay. Indeed, may you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. For this one, I think is formal, unknown.
Yeah,
There's
it's
2
2
lines.
lines. Yeah, I would agree. This one's hard. They don't seem to have an obvious intentional relationship. Maybe developmental expansion, but it really seems like sort of 2 different ideas here. So I would agree. What I put was unknown. It's not clear to me. There may
So
be
I think one of the translation put the last verse, the peace be upon Israel, separately from others.
Yeah, the New
Just,
King
yeah.
James did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it made it its own separate statement. And it could be. Because it's kind of, there's a few of these songs of ascent that end that way. Psalm 125 has that, peace be upon Israel, where it doesn't really, it's another song of ascent. As for those who turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord will lead them away with the doers of iniquity. And then he has peace be upon Israel. Doesn't seem to be connected. Sort of just a general statement, which again would make sense for them to have this, these songs of ascent as people are gathering for these feasts, coming together to celebrate what God has done for his people in Israel. This idea of peace or prosperity upon Israel is sort of a general statement or prayer even. So kind of would make sense that to have that sort of an ending, it maybe its own statement. So yeah, verse 6 is, I think, probably John Cheng's conclusion at being formal or unknown. I would agree with. So let me go back to the, are there any questions? Okay, let me go back to, we'll just spend the last few minutes. Want to introduce something to you that you may find interesting, but hopefully a little bit helpful. Again, it's like, how do the translations, how do they determine the number of lines within the poem? All right, because we're going to base our parallelism analysis on the number of lines. So it's pretty important that we understand, where do these come from? And why is there a difference? Like, for example, in verse 5, New American Standard had the 2 lines, but the ESV and the New King James had 3, and the NIV as well had 3 lines. So how do we know who's correct? Well, these lines come from, if we go to the Hebrew text, all right, I want to show you something. All right, you can see in the Hebrew text, these are the large font, these are the letters, the Hebrew letters, okay? And notice above the letters, so let me take, above and below the letters, we have other markings, okay? Some are vowel markings. So for example, this little dot with this yod is a vowel, all right? The same with this line here. It looks like an underline, it's a vowel. This is a vowel, all right? These two dots are a vowel, okay? These two dots here that are vertical, like a column, are called a shawah. They're involved in how to pronounce this particular word. This T here is another vowel, okay? So we have those kinds of markings. We also have what are called accent markings. Notice on the top, see an accent here. We see an accent mark here, another one here. We also see, there are also dividers. This little hat here, or triangle, it's divider. See that again here. See the same thing in verse 3. All right, notice there's this marking along with this marking. So all these markings are either indicating a vowel, indicating a pronunciation identifier, or an accent where you would put emphasis on what syllable. Or in the case of poetry, there are certain accent marks that are used to identify the lines. All right, let me show you. I put together a little, call this advanced topic. And if this doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. I just, sometimes some folks like to know, okay, well, where do these things come from? How do these translations determine number of lines? Well, here, let me show you, there are several accent marks used both in narratives, but also in poetry. And in poetry, some of the accent marks actually identify the line divisions within a verse, all right? A principal or strong dividing accent mark is known as the ole we'ored, all right? And it's where you've got this, I don't know if you can see it here, this little arrow and then a little dash here on the bottom. You guys see that? And we saw that over here in Psalm 128. If I expand this word here, can you guys see it? Notice there's that arrow thing, and then we have that little sort of dash thing below. Okay, that marker is identifying the first line. Okay, in verse 3. So that what it means is the verse, that line ends here. So where you see that accent marker, that's the last word of that line. Okay, and then notice there's another kind of that's one type of accent that marks a division. There's a second kind that's very common as well, called an athnak. It also marks a principal division and often will follow this ole we'ored. All right, it's another kind of accent mark that we'll see, and I already showed you one here. Okay, we've got one of those down here on this word. We've got one in verse 2 here. So that means that verse 2 is divided at the end of that word. So there'll be 2 lines in verse 2. And if we go to English translation, that's exactly what we see. 2 lines in verse 2. The last word being of your hands. All right, so if we go back to this, oops, where are we? Here it says, this is you shall eat, when you shall eat. Right, the fruit, this is fruit. Sorry. Fruit of your hands, when you shall eat. All right, and that's, sorry about that. That's the first line, and then the second line is you will be blessed, blessed are you, and good for you. So it will be well with you. Okay, but the Hebrew text with this accent mark here indicates where the division occurs. All right, same thing if we go up to verse 1, we're going to get the same. This is a song of ascent, so that's just the title, introduction, and then it's blessed all fearing Yahweh, and then notice up there's that Athnak, so that's the end of line 1. How blessed are all fearing Yahweh, and then we have the second line is here, right? Who walks in his ways. All right, so if we go to, so that's 2 lines indicated, and if we go to the translation, that's exactly what we see, 2 lines. All right, and so here are the 2 more common accent marks, but there are also a few used occasionally. One's called a Revia Gadol, another's a Revia Migrash. All right, and the Gadol, it looks like a diamond. You can see that here, a diamond above. So it has 2 functions here. One is it's giving the accent, so we give emphasis to this syllable. So it's wood no ra. All right, ra has the accent, but also this marker is sometimes used as to indicate there's a division. So after this word, there'll be the end of that line. Okay, and then there's another one here. It's also a diamond, and then it has that other little dash kind of mark next to it. That's a Revia Migrash. And then there's also another one known as a Zarga. Oops, what happened here? Which is this kind of line here. All right, so there's several actually division markers. These are the more common ones. These first 2, the Athnak and the Ole Yored, is you usually find these in every line. And then sometimes if you have multiple lines, you'll see these other ones that I mentioned. Okay. And so now where do these accent marks come from? Well, here I have a copy. This is a copy of the Hebrew text here. So you can see, you open up here's Psalm 128. So this is the Hebrew text. You can see that here. So the Hebrew words, this is Psalm 128 here. This Hebrew text was, over the years, the Masoretes, they were those who made copies, who were copying the Bible. They lived around, I think, several hundred years after Christ. But they, from their knowledge of the Hebrew language, they had put in these different accent marks because the original Hebrew text was just the consonants, just the letters. But then they noted the vowels and also these accent marks based on their understanding. And so these accent marks sort of come from what they believed represented or reflected the original text. And so translators those that are astute, those paying attention, will use those accent marks to identify the various lines in the text, but they don't always agree. That's why we see a difference in the lines. And so what I recommend we do is when you see, you need to compare your translation that you're using. If you're using English translation, compare to different English translations and see how many lines they have. And then what I do is just go with the majority. So I look at the ESV, the New King James, and the NASB. And then basically what I do is take whichever two agree. So if you have disagreement, if two agree, then I will go with the majority. So for example, in this case, with verse 5, if we go back up to verse 5 here, if you remember, the New American Standard has had 2 lines, right? Lord bless you. But the ESV has 3 lines, and the New King James has 3 lines. So my sort of simplistic approach is then I'm going to say it's 3 lines because the majority wins. Now, I have found this approach to usually be correct. And if you go back and look at verse 3, actually the Hebrew accents support 3 lines. So for whatever reason, New American Standard only had 2. I think they missed one of the accents. And sometimes that happens. Okay. So what I recommend you do is if you're doing English, parallelism in English translation, you look at the New American Standard, the ESV, and the New King James. And if they all agree, great. Go with that. But sometimes there may be disagreement, as in this case. And I would go with the 3 lines because the ESV and the New King James both have 3 lines. And then for me, I always just go back to the Hebrew text and confirm. So for example, and I put those here, I'll put these in your notes. You can look at them and study them in more detail. I put every verse of Psalm 128, and I noted the accent mark to show, in this case, in verse 1, we just have the one accent mark, the athnak. So there's going to be division after this word, and that's exactly, this is Yahweh, this word here. So it's how blessed all fearing Yahweh, and then who walks in his ways, line 2 here. And that's exactly correct, 2 lines. All right, if we go to verse 2, we see only one accent mark, that's a division. Again, it's the athnak here. So it tells us there's going to be 2 lines. And that's exactly what the translation has. Now, verse 3, this is the one that Shulong did. Verse 3 has several accent markers. It has that Ole Woyoreth here. All right, so there's going to be one division here. There's the athnak over here, so there's another division here. And then there's that Zagra here. So there's going to be 4 lines. And that's exactly what we see. Your wife, like a fruitful vine, in your house. So here's line 1, line 2, and then your children, like olive shoots or plants, line 3, and then surrounding or around your table, line 4. Okay? So that's how they determine there are 4 lines from the author on this one. Okay? Then we get to verse 4. We have just, in this case, only one accent here. It's that Revia Gadol. So there's going to be just 2 lines, right? Behold, for thus blessed the man shall be blessed. And then we have fearing Yahweh. Okay, so that's why there's 2 lines here, because there's this less used, less common accent mark, the Revia Gadol. All right, then we get to verse 5, as we just talked about, which shows 2 strong, these are strong division accent marks, one here and one here. Notice we have that particular Weyeth, or sorry, Ola Weoreth here that I've circled. So this is blessed you, the Yahweh from Zion. Lord bless you from Zion. And then we have, this is line 1. And then we have see, let you see good for Jerusalem, the good of Jerusalem. Line 2. And then all the days of your life. Line 3. All right. Now the King James or the New American Standard only had 2 lines, but I think the accent mark supports what the ESV and New King James identified as 3 lines. And then we look at verse 6, the last verse. Oops. We just see the Athnak here. So 2 lines. Let you see your children of your children, your children's children. Peace upon Israel. So line 1, line 2. Okay. Now, like I say, you don't need to go into, pull out your Hebrew text and try to figure out all these accents. I'm just showing you this so you have some idea of how do they figure out these lines, where do they come from. There is a science to it. There is an approach to it. And like I said, normally the translations will agree, but once in a while, I think because of those minor accent marks, sometimes they may not notice or see it. You might find some differences, but you don't have to worry about that. I would just do, like I said, my basic approach is take the New American Standard, the ESV, and the New King James, and just see which 2 agree. And sometimes, many times, all 3 will agree, so there's no problem. But if you have a difference, just go with the majority. And I found that to be, for the most part, give you the correct answer, as it did here in Psalm 128. We went with the ESV New King James that said 3 lines for verse 5, and that's exactly what the accent marks support. So, like I said, if none of that made sense, don't worry about it. You don't have to go into that when you do your own study, but I did at least want to show you, for those of you who might be interested, kind of a little more insight or detail into where these lines come from. But gone over time a little bit, but any questions on that? I'll put all of that in your notes so you can kind of look at it more detail. It's to me, very interesting, but not everyone is into that kind of stuff. So, but thought at least I would expose you to it. And but any questions, comments, thoughts before we? I think Brother Dwayne's ready for bed, so.
That was very interesting.
Actually, Dr. Barrick's the one that taught me. I learned this from him. Actually, he's done an extensive study of the Psalms, so he's looked into a lot of the accent marks, things like that. So I think he has some material on his website for that, but I gave you sort of the hopefully simplified version just to give you an idea. Okay, well, I'm going to ask Brother Dwayne to close our time in prayer.